Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Ramah McKay. I'm Assistant Professor of History and Sociology of Science and a faculty affiliate in the Center for Africana Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. This is the fourth and final program in the Center's Fall Faculty Research Colloquium, which has highlighted emergent and recent conversations in the field of Africana Studies. And I'm really thrilled to host this afternoon's program, which features a conversation with my colleague, Nolwazi Mkhwanazi. So one of the wonderful things about COVID is that it has normalized events like this over Zoom and opened up possibilities for talking with people outside of Philly and outside of the US. So when I had the opportunity to organize one of these events, I knew immediately who I wanted to invite. Today's speaker, Professor Nolwazi Mkhwanazi. So Dr. Mkhwanazi is based in Johannesburg, South Africa, where she's an associate professor in anthropology at the University of the Witwatersrand and director of the Medical Humanities Program at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, or WISER. And I've long enjoyed reading and thinking with her creative and compelling research on young people in South Africa. And I find her to be a particularly astute observer of the practice and limits of the discipline of anthropology in which I'm trained and in which both of us work, and a particularly kind of savvy and creative thinker about how we might transform the kinds of work that happen in academic spaces and through academic disciplines and publications. So when I invited her, I asked her to talk about her research on the lives of young people, which has explored gendered identities, sexuality, reproduction, intimacy, kinship, and care. This work has been published in two recent co-edited volumes. The first, Young Families, Gender, Sexuality, and Care, with Divya Bana, was published in 2017. And unfortunately, the hard copy of it is in my office on campus and not here, but I can show you her more recent publication, Connected Lives, Families, Households, Health, and Care in South Africa, which just came out this fall and was put together with Lenore Manderson. So I asked whether she might talk about these books and her work, but also might reflect broadly on academic practice, particularly with regard to health and health studies, and perhaps on the impact of COVID on kind of academic thinking, life, and work from the vantage point of Joburg. And she graciously accepted this kind of ridiculously tall order, and I was so delighted. So before turning over the floor, I'll just add further that she recently convened a month-long virtual medical humanities conference as part of an initiative to build the medical humanities in South Africa. And if you're interested in the kinds of work that she's discussing today, you can find more on the conference website, which is available at breath.medicalandhealthhumanities.africa. And there's also a link on the announcement that was circulated for today's event. So thank you so much, Nolwazi, for joining us. And I'll turn the floor over to you to talk a little bit about your work.
Thank you very much, Ramah, for introducing me and for inviting me. I've prepared a talk for this session, and the talk will begin with a brief summary of my academic journey and also how I came to be interested in the issue of care. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I call young families and the book Connected Lives. And then I will end with some comments about hard lockdown and on caregiving in South African Black communities. So let me begin with a description of my kind of academic journey. When I finished high school, I spent 6 months in the US, and it was here that I was introduced to midwifery. Before this, I actually had no idea what midwives were, and suddenly I was surrounded by home birthing midwives who were very passionate about their craft. I knew very quickly that I wanted to be a midwife, and unfortunately, I was too late to apply to medical school, and so I decided to apply for a general Bachelor of Arts degree, and anthropology was one of my subjects. In the second year of anthropology at the University of Cape Town, I was introduced to medical anthropology by Alcinda Honwana, who was one of the people lecturing in the course. She used the example of midwives to illustrate how particular ideas about the body influence the kinds of practitioners one uses. I was hooked, and so I decided that I would do a PhD in anthropology, and that during my fieldwork, I would actually apprentice with a lay midwife and learn the craft. From then on, all my research papers were about pregnancy and childbirth. And when I arrived in Cambridge, where I did my MPhil and PhD, I was asked what my research interests were, and I explained that I was interested in pregnancy and childbirth. I was told that the person who was working on this issue, Françoise Barbier-Friedman, was no longer taking students. Unfortunately, she made an exception and she became my supervisor. Françoise was not only a medical anthropologist who specializes in pregnancy and childbirth, but she was also a practicing midwife who attended home births. She also knew many of the midwives that I'd actually met in the US. And so in what could have been quite an alienating environment, it felt like arriving home. So since my interest in teenage pregnancy specifically arose because at the time I was quite young, and my initial research into teenage pregnancy was driven by what I saw as an inconsistency between the reported successes of sexuality education campaigns in South Africa at the beginning of the 21st century and the high rates of teenage pregnancy. A lot of the research in South Africa at the time was interested in the causes and consequences of teenage pregnancy. And the causes that were often cited were rape, ignorance, not wanting to use a contraceptive, proving womanhood, a desire to hold on to a boyfriend, and poverty. And the consequences of becoming pregnant during the teenage years were said to be the disruption of schooling, socioeconomic disadvantage, negative obstetric outcomes, inadequate mothering, relationship difficulties, and the neglect and abuse of a child. So when I read these studies on teenage pregnancy in South Africa, I was struck by the amazing similarities in the findings of South African researchers and those based in North America and Britain. And I soon realized that a lot of the researchers were actually drawing upon particular methodological and theoretical frameworks that were developed and used in Euro-American research on teenage pregnancy. And my sense was that these frameworks could not adequately describe the situation in South Africa, where apartheid had, and some argue continues to, play an important role in influencing people's sexual and reproductive health behavior. So in my view, these studies that the researchers were producing in South Africa were not able to adequately account for the influence of external factors in the particular occurrence of teenage pregnancy, especially in Black communities. And this was partly because there was a focus on the causes and consequences, but also because the studies tended to generate a gender-based account of how teenage pregnancy came to be. And it made teenage pregnancy seem to be an isolated event, and that the solution would simply be targeting girls who were seen to be at risk. So in my actual fieldwork, I didn't focus on teenage pregnancy per se, because I mean, already as one can imagine, teenage young pregnant women already have a hard time, and often they're made fun of and laughed at by people. So instead, what I did is I immersed myself in the lives of young people generally. And by doing this, I became interested in relationships, since my very being in the township was predicated on my relationships with various people. And it was through my experience of being in Nyanga East that the issue of gendered identities became a prominent feature of my work on teenage pregnancy. And simply, the argument that I presented was that the occurrence and management of early childbearing in this particular community was inextricably tied to the production and reproduction of gendered identities. And I was also able to explore the values and the norms which underlay particular gendered constructions. I went further to suggest that even though it could be said that teenage pregnancy in Nyanga East was so common that it could be described as a norm, it was actually and usually considered a crisis for the individual and a crisis for the families involved. However, there were particular mechanisms that were in place that actually helped families to effectively manage this crisis at the social level. So ultimately, through the focus on the production and reproduction of gendered identities, I discussed the role that teenage pregnancy played in the making and remaking of social worlds under conditions of extreme hardship and poverty. So in my initial field stay, my age actually made it easier to have a range of conversations that went beyond the immediate focus on early childbearing, and actually included young people questioning, for example, the need to undergo a male initiation. We also spoke a lot about experiences of living in a township and young people's perceptions of being in the city or of going to the city, their aspirations and ideas about their futures. In hindsight, what was critical was that I was able to speak to my interlocutors openly about sex and relationships without having to observe particular unspoken gender and generational norms of who you can and cannot speak to openly about sex. And returning to the field over the past 20 years, my conversations with young people have become less open and more guarded. And I've had to adjust to no longer having such open relationships with young people who have increasingly come to see me as someone older and as someone who needs to be respected. In my returns to the field, what's been interesting is that I've also been able to witness many of the young girls and boys that I worked with in my initial field stay in 2001 become mothers and fathers themselves. This has led me to broadening my research in order to also explore changing family structures in urban townships, specifically focusing on the reproduction of young urban families. So over the past 2 decades, I've also seen many changes happen in Nyanga East, which have reflected some of the research that the young scholars in the Young Families book were also writing about. And one of the changes is the involvement of fathers in the care of a child who is born to a teenage mother. What this means, among other things, is that less weight is being paid to the importance of paying inhlawulo, which is a guarantee of care and patrilineal lineage. I find this particularly interesting because the one thing that it does do is it says so much about the place and importance of tradition in contemporary urban townships. It also points to people privileging kinship and relatedness over tradition. But in terms of practical childcare arrangement, it makes a significant difference for a child to be able to move between 2 sets of kin. As we know, the birth of any child is important in creating networks of relatedness. So my interest in families is in the diverse ways in which families are created, and in particular in young families. And this term, young families, really is meant to cover young mothers, young fathers, and young grandmothers and grandfathers. Because in South Africa for a long time, people spoke about the children of teenagers being sent to live with their grandmothers. And in the case of Xhosa-speaking people, this was often in the Eastern Cape, which is a different province. And the community that I worked with in Nyanga East is a Xhosa-speaking community. The grandmothers in these narratives are often thought of as being old and of being of pensionable age. And this idea that we're beginning to see with young families, that the grandmother herself might be working and she might still be of reproductive age, brings up very interesting questions about how decisions are made about the care of a child that is born to a teenage mother. What factors are considered and who actually makes those decisions? So Young Families, the book, which is this one, was co-edited with Stevie Bana, as Ramah just said, who is a professor of education and who also holds an NRF, which is a National Research Foundation chair in gender and childhood sexuality at one of our universities in KwaZulu-Natal. And the book was actually a very important project for me in many ways, in that I wanted to specifically produce an edited volume on young families in order to make accessible the recent scholarship on teenage pregnancy that I was reading in MA and PhD theses of the students from both KwaZulu-Natal and Cape Town, as well as Johannesburg. And my sense was that there was a new and kind of growing body of research, which was mainly being conducted by emerging Black scholars, and that this particular research constituted an important departure from earlier studies, specifically because these researchers spent a long time in the communities they were working in, and sometimes they actually came from those communities. So what they did, which was different, is that they took seriously the particular local ideas that they encountered, and understood them as important in actually influencing how people acted. And given that many of the young scholars who are published in the book had no or very little experience in writing papers for publication, compiling the edited volume for me was a means by which us as editors could also help to mentor each author. Just a quick thing about the word family and the way that I'm using it. The word family in young families and in all the work that I do is not meant to describe a family constituted only through blood and or marriage. It is essentially about how people make relatedness and build and or are absorbed in relationships of care. So Young Families, the book actually allows us to see that families are made and unmade, and also how making families is fluid, flexible, and an ever-changing process, and one that is affected by a range of factors. So in South Africa, paternity and the presence of fathers has been a central issue. And my ongoing research has revealed new dynamics around the centrality of paternity. What I observed in the early 2000s was a norm in denying paternity. And recently, many young men are actively claiming paternity. However, in many situations, claim to paternities are not all accepted. Families may actually consciously ignore these kind of genealogical links by denying the claims to paternity, particularly for men who they feel are not able to support their children, or for men whom they don't want to have future links with. So the acknowledgement of paternity may actually also be accepted from men who are not able to perform the rights that legitimate those claims, such as paying inhlawulo. So family here is really a word that relates to how people make connections and create relationships of care for themselves and for others. And care is something that I've become deeply interested in of late. And specifically, I'm interested in households that have very young children and very old people, because such households allow an investigation of the issue of care at different ends of the life course, both at birth and in old age. And as we know, what care means and how it manifests is not always apparent. There are obvious forms of care, such as day-to-day tasks that are required to ensure that people are fed, washed, and clothed. But there are also other forms of care that are not so visible and are often overlooked. For instance, when a teenager becomes a mother, the questions of care that arise are not only about who is going to care for the child, but it's also about the care between generations of women, between daughters, mothers, and grandmothers. So the second book, Connected Lives, which Ramah showed you, was authored and co-edited with Lenore Manderson, who is a distinguished professor of public health and medical anthropology at the University of the Witwatersrand. And this book actually explores how contemporary changes in family making, in household composition, and in kinship relations influence decisions about caregiving and support. The book contains case studies that are integrated throughout the 7 chapters that make up the book. And the case studies really consider how families are constituted and how in different households, people care for each other, care for the children, the sick, and the elderly. And the book actually arose from a conference that Lenore and I organized, which was meant to create conversation and share findings between people coming from different disciplines, but working in South Africa. And Connected Live actually showcases the work of 40 authors who range from emerging to established scholars, as I said, from various disciplines, also from various university and research institutes in South Africa, on the continent, and beyond. So the book actually draws attention to how people in households manage everyday tasks and challenges, while also negotiating structural and economic constraints and the competing needs and demands of caregiving. The case studies are actually striking in their nuanced and thick description of life lived in South Africa. and they reflect engagements and encounters at multiple and disparate points. And in a sense, they offer a unique picture of diversity, warmth, kindness, and care that disrupt the notion of a singular way of life. Let me move to the third and final part of my talk, which is about family-based during hard lockdown in South Africa. So in South Africa, in the first 2 months of hard lockdown, which was March and April, much of the spotlight fell on the numbers of those infected, those who required care, and those who were actually providing biomedical care. And there was very little focus on family-based care and on those who provide care within families, especially with regard to the experiences and whatever challenges that they face. And as we know, families and households in South Africa are the locus of the majority of care work. And this care work is often, but not always, deeply gendered. So usually when families are faced with a sudden health crisis, household and family members often find themselves having to balance the particular care needs and demands against immediate economic needs and opportunities. They often make decisions taking into account time and cash constraints and other long-term considerations, which may include education and the long-term well-being and security of children. In the decisions reached, it is common for relatively healthy and older female householders to take on the everyday and higher care needs of co-resident children, frail older people, and others who require assistance with everyday care. So the burden of care may be alleviated by intra and extra familial care relationships and with resources both within and among households connected through family ties. So the availability of these networks and resources has a significant impact on the health status of those who are in poor health and or have complex health needs. It also has an impact more generally on how health and well-being are produced and maintained in households. So for example, where children are raised, where people are nursed if they're very ill or need monitoring. So while these networks and the resources that they bring are actually acknowledged by policymakers and the government as being quite critical for people living in precarious conditions, they are indispensable for those family members who provide care, especially as is often the case when their needs are often overlooked. So let me just say 3 things about this last point. Firstly, with regard to family members who provide care, there's often an assumption that the members of a family care about each other. And so physical and other forms of care, like cooking, cleaning, assisting with self-care and so on, are actually provided unproblematically and without stress. As we know, care is very demanding, physically, financially, and emotionally. So most caregivers actually provide care under very stressful conditions, which in turn affect their mental well-being. And with the rise in job losses in South Africa over COVID, there were over 2 million jobs lost. Uncertainty about the future, as well as the possibility of infection and death for those with compromised health, who actually may be receiving a grant that helps the household keep going. Caring for people under COVID and during COVID-19 is actually undoubtedly stressful. A second point is that it's also largely assumed that family members who provide care to others in the household know how to care when care needs are actually complicated, for example, if someone has comorbidities. And for resource reasons, relatively little attention is paid to assisting people to learn to give care to others in need. And the third point is really that caregivers and care recipients are implicitly assumed to be separate categories, and that there is actually little confusion between who provides care and who is in need of care. But as we know, at any time, a person who is responsible for care may also be in need of care. And often the caregivers in many South African Black communities are often older. And so they might be providing high-level care to others while their own care is being compromised or declining. So just by way of ending, I want to leave you with these final thoughts on the South African experience of COVID-19. Popular sentiment and state discourse emphasizes the role of the family in meeting the care needs for those who are young, dependent, have limits to their capability, are ill, are elderly or frail. It is likely that as the pandemic progresses, and it looks like we're actually entering a second period of a rise in infections, that householders who have undertaken or contributed to care work financially, physically, and emotionally may become ill themselves and unable to continue with this care work. So anything from economic constraints and deprivation, the loss of work, sudden illness, social upheaval, violence, or growing isolation is likely to undo the stability of the household and the predictability of family-based care wherever it has previously been in place. In small households especially, a single event can actually unsettle the balance of care and leave a big dent in household resilience. So the question for me really is what will happen then when households and families aren't, for a variety of reasons, able to meet the care needs of their members? And furthermore, while the state has taken the role of crisis care under lockdown, such as providing food for people and increasing the amount of grants, when lockdown actually ends, will the state retreat from this responsibility, which surely acknowledges the difficulty people face in providing everyday care? For us sitting here in South Africa, the actions of the state during lockdown and after lockdown will be critical in revealing how the state supports and undermines the ability of families and households to provide care. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nolwazi. That was so rich and thoughtful, and I look forward to talking about it. Before I launch into my questions, I'll just note for the audience that there's a Q&A kind of button at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to type your questions. We will have time for audience questions in a few minutes. So if you have questions, please feel free to type them there, and I will read them or call on you when we get to that stage of things. But Nolwazi, I love this. I love the way you narrated your kind of own aspirations to being a midwife and how this set you on this path of thinking about families and relationships and the kinds of academic and professional relationships through which you became a scholar, and that now you can bring others into that scholarly trajectory as well. And I was thinking about that in relation also to something that you mentioned earlier in a conversation, in our conversation just beforehand, when you used the phrase an ethics of care, and thinking about all of this as kind of reflecting and engaging with an ethics of care that both becomes visible in your work on families, but that also is sort of guiding how you do that work. So I had that in my mind, and I was listening to your talk and appreciating so much your kind of description of families, not as structures that we inherit and then inhabit in some kind of static way, but as like a site of constant negotiation and kind of assembling the relationships that we live in, and also of care as this site of constant negotiation, and that it's not clear, even when we are engaged in the activities of caring, where those bounds of responsibility within relationships lie. And so I was curious to hear more about both the kind of ethics of care that seem to be guiding this work and the kind of political consequences of thinking about care and about families as like sites of serious political, ethical investigation and writing.
Okay. I suppose, I mean, one of the key things in South Africa around families, and especially the experience and constitution and emergence of families comes from the experience of apartheid. So what apartheid tried to do, especially in Black communities, is to break down families. So migrant labor, which took away men and kept women and children in homelands, was essentially about dismantling the family. And so right now, one of the issues in South Africa is trying to reconstitute what they see, what people call kind of healthy families, which provide care. But what's not taken into account is the changing nature of how families are being formed. And so when we talk about absent men as one of the key issues, which continues to be the narrative, is that men don't care, men don't want to be part of families. And I guess I'm trying to change that narrative and show how families are being constituted in new ways, and men are actually playing a very important role in that, by choosing to care, for example, but also that women sometimes refuse relationships of care from men. And so I guess the family is never static, and I'm trying to show different forms of families that are happening, and especially something that is stigmatized, like early childbearing, that the families that are created around that are actually families of care, and families that can provide care for what is seen as a big concern in society, in many societies around the world, also just generally. Yeah.
I was really struck when you were describing the idea of young families and your kind of initial work, and this idea that becoming pregnant when you're young is often seen as a crisis, and yet that crisis doesn't mean that families aren't assembled and aren't providing care to one another. And it seems to me in some ways you're chasing out an idea of relationships as precisely those things that can respond to crisis and that can reform after moments of rupture and crisis. That shouldn't be the end point of analysis, but rather one of many things that our work can encompass and describe.
I completely agree with you, but I suppose one of my key kind of something that I grapple with is the notion and intergenerational families, because a lot of teenage mothers will live with their own mothers. And so there you have kind of three generations: the child, the mother, and her mother. And those grandmothers, as I pointed out in my talk, no one actually has ever spoken about the fact that they themselves might still be having children and still be expanding on that middle family. And the dynamics between both mother and daughter is incredibly important, because if you're, for example, 36 as a grandmother, you're still working and you're still probably providing income for the household, and you're still sexually active or of reproductive age, I should rather say that. And so, and that changes the dynamics of care and how decisions are made. And the idea that also that teenage mothers actually leave school because of pregnancy is not particularly true, at least in Younger East, because their mothers find a different way of negotiating how care happens, and that's when claims to paternity and accepting those are incredibly important, because it gives another family a chance to look after and to care for the child. And so those are the kind of dynamics that I find particularly interesting and I'm grappling with. And also that the decisions that are made in terms of the best way to provide care are not always received as being caring, as being positive. Sometimes care deeply hurts. Yeah.
So I wanted to shift, part of me wants to to continue on this frame, and another part of me wanted to sort of shift to ask about how attention to care, how your thinking on care also kind of refracts through your publication strategies, and this idea of moving forward your own ideas about research, but also bringing in other researchers. And you talked about in both Young Families and Connected Lives, kind of strategic choices that you are making about also working with, mentoring, facilitating the work of young scholars in particular. And I think thinking about the different kinds of knowledge that we can produce at different points in our career when we are young and as we get older, and how we can harness or be in conversation with people who are thinking at different stages in their careers is really interesting. So one of the pieces of your writing that has circulated very widely in medical anthropology and other courses is a kind of riff on Chimamanda Adichie's critique of the single story. And you wrote about the dangers of a single kind of medical anthropology story and the ways in which quite narrow understandings of health and illness on the African continent often dominate medical anthropological literature. And in the preface to Connected Lives, you and your co-author write that you kind of try to put this critique into practice in the very structure and composition of the book. And so you talk about how the book is organized, how different people participate in it, the way that this kind of writing of case studies and kind of academic research can articulate with knowledge that's being produced often by people with anthropological or other kinds of scholarly training, but who are working outside the academy, who might be writing NGO reports or government reports or other kinds of literature, and to kind of bring them into the conversation. So I really loved the idea that telling new stories and generating new theory from the South or from the African continent requires thinking differently and critically about knowledge production, research, teaching, publication, and maybe entails a kind of ethic of care towards knowledge production itself, as well as care as an object of study. So I wondered if you could say more about those kinds of choices and the process, the idea of the edited volume as a kind of intervention into a single way of telling academic stories.
Okay, so I mean, my passion for thinking differently about books and trying to also help other scholars publish their work in a kind of internationally accessible way actually came from my postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Fort Hare, which is one of the previously disadvantaged universities, which also means that it's still today quite under-resourced. But what happened there is I was invited to participate in a workshop that was led by ASEO, who is a Chilean organization that has online workshops on publishing and writing for internationally peer-reviewed journals. And what happened there is that I came to know that a lot of researchers, especially in sexual and reproductive health and rights on the continent, actually face three main barriers. And one of them is that a lot of journals publish in English. The second is that there's a sense that kind of locally produced knowledge is not good enough for international journals. And then the third one is that people, because of under-resourced universities and so forth, actually are isolated from particular discourse communities. And what that also means is that a lot of publications about, for example, about South Africa the majority are written by people from outside of South Africa, possibly mainly from the global north. So it's thinking about how do we shift that? How do we get people who we know are doing good work, for example, in South Africa, to get their work published? And the intervention of both Young Families and Connected Lives was about that. And in both books, we actually are publishing work from scholars ranging from the MA all the way kind of to senior professors. And what we asked the professors to do, especially with the Young Families, is to actually co-author with some of the kind of younger authors. And this was a really important way to both mentor the authors as well as expose them to particular kind of, I suppose, academic practices around publishing. And with Young Families, Divya and I actually held a number of workshops with the authors, and for the final chapters, in finalizing the chapters, I actually flew to meet every single one of the authors and sit with them. And that was important for me, and I suppose is another way of enacting care. And yeah, I mean, yes.
That's wonderful. And there's something about the idea of flying to sit with people, thinking about your talk and your sort of own narration of how your trajectory evolved through going to different places, coming to the US, going to Cambridge, through like forming relationships or encountering ideas in different spaces. And then also thinking about the way that theory travels, where it can travel from, and to how it gets kind of stuck. There's something very nice in thinking concretely about how ideas need to circulate, or how they're produced out of these kinds of physical movements, or conversations over Zoom, perhaps. Too.
Yeah. I mean, what I am extremely proud about with young families, as I mentioned in the talk, is that many scholars are young Black scholars, and there is a new kind of thinking around early childbearing, around young families that they're producing, and the kind of scholarship that we're doing around early childbearing is stuck in a particular place. Where people aren't in communities, and many people just kind of fly in, do a survey and so forth, and then come back out. And these young people are sitting in those communities, and they understand particular local values and norms and how those might affect the occurrence of a teenage pregnancy. And that is really important. We have a chapter by Vuyong Kani, who was writing about her community, and she was writing about the different way in which inhlawulo is enacted from what we have always known, and how this is constantly negotiated with families. And she was able to actually give us concrete kind of empirical evidence of how that's happening. And that hardly happens with many of the studies that I was talking about before. And also many people don't have that kind of access to communities. So I found what they were producing incredibly exciting and interesting, but also because publications also seem to be stuck in a particular place. If you don't know how to write, the chances of your articles being rejected are high. And my co-editors, Divya and Lenore, I strongly feel that an intervention needs to be made where we produce material that can also be taught in South African classrooms. So with Connected Lives, we have case studies there. So we have 29 case studies from 40 authors, some of them co-authored. And we published with a local press precisely because the people who read books from this press are both kind of academics and policymakers, analysts. So our work is kind of accessible to a wider audience beyond the university. And secondly, because the books will become open access. And we're hoping, especially with Connected Lives, that the case studies will be used to teach in classrooms, both in high school, as undergrad classes, and in postgraduate classes, as kind of discussion points.
Yeah.
They can be taken out of the kind of text that Lenore and I write between each case study, because they reflect life lived in South Africa. And if we can hopefully get these books into South African classrooms, that would be fantastic.
Yes, I love that idea that to think new questions, and also to produce theory in a wider range of places. We have to think not just about academic writing, but how we're teaching it, and how people are encountering ideas, and what kinds of spaces might open up for engagement. I see we have a number of questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask one final question, and then let the audience kind of participate a little bit as well. And so a final question comes, maybe to speak to your kind of like last set of points around COVID, but also the question of kind of representation and what kinds of knowledge differently situated researchers are able to produce. So you contributed a piece to a forum hosted by the Wenner Gren Foundation on COVID and anthropology, which is bringing together scholars from different places, although I think mostly people based in the US, to think about what COVID-19 is the kinds of questions that COVID-19 is posing for anthropological work. And one of the observations you made was that in South Africa, you saw many researchers kind of drawing parallels between the HIV pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of sort of how to think about epidemic disease and maybe kind of epidemiological ideas, but also to think about the kinds of representational regimes that accompany illness. And you noted that in mentoring students, you find that in fact, South African students are often hesitant to write about HIV, both because they understand the kind of stakes that that there may be harm posed to their interlocutors if they're not cautious and careful about how information circulates, but also because of an awareness that there's a kind of dominant narrative about within social, scientific, and popular discourses about the African continent in which disease and illness kind of loom overly large. So you wrote in this post, I think the care and caution that we observe around HIV will be important with regard to the kinds of questions that we ask in the time of coronavirus. This will depend on responses to COVID-19 and the stories that emerge about its spread, who gets infected and how they become infected. At the moment, vulnerability to infection is not in the popular imaginary about socioeconomic status, race, and gender, but rather about compromised immune systems, which highlight issues of age and health, including nutrition, comorbidities, sanitation, and housing, all of which are major issues for the majority of South Africa's population and are differently experienced in relation to race and class. And so I was just curious to hear what your sort of vantage point thinking, whether through questions of families and caregiving, but also your vantage point thinking about illness and kind of narratives of illness from the vantage point of South Africa or from Johannesburg, might help you to ask questions that are different than some of the questions that are being asked about COVID, including these questions of what kinds of stories do we want to tell, or how can we tell stories that disrupt the notion of a singular way of life or a singular experience of COVID.
So one of the kind of narratives in my kind of academic circles has been about how doing research during kind of COVID-19 pandemic and acknowledging that this presents a unique opportunity for many researchers, including medical anthropologists, because this is one of the first times that people are living through a pandemic, which in South Africa is not quite true, given the AIDS pandemic. But since South Africa has reached level 1 and we're able to travel, I've been traveling a lot to one of the townships in Johannesburg, and it's quite clear that we all have very different experiences of COVID-19. And kind of where I live, the army did not have a presence, but in particular township, there was a very strong army presence. And the stories that people are telling about that presence are really quite striking and very, very different from kind of the experiences of myself and my colleagues who mainly sat in Zoom meetings or whatever, were able to drive to shops. And I'm also, so my experience and my kind of interlocutors in the township is very different because of the very particular military and police presence that they had, especially the migrant hostels. And I think these kinds of stories need to be told rather than what I initially said, which was about stigma and different, about stigma and trying to think differently and trying to think different questions. I think the experiences of, and trying to think differently about how to approach what causes, how people think about what causes COVID-19, who's likely to get infected, how they get infected. That's where that piece, that's where I was going. And I thought those would be interesting stories. But actually now, having had these kind of conversations, that's not what I would like to write about in terms of people's experiences of COVID-19. So hopefully, I mean, in that piece, I was also asking or imploring anthropologists in South Africa to hold back a little bit instead of jumping in that very kind of uncaring way, but rather let the stories themselves come from how people experience things. And yeah, because there was a need to write about this pandemic, which was seen as a unique opportunity.
Yes, and a unique moment to become sort of relevant as medical anthropologists. I feel like we have something to say. So I would like to get to at least some of the audience questions, although I have many more pages of questions of my own. And I see that there's two that kind of relate to points you just made. So there's a question that asks you to comment on recent trends, whether pre-COVID or during COVID, to do with migration and the way that rural to urban migration or urban to urban migration shapes kind of family making. And there's another question about unmaking families, and someone expressing appreciation for your point about how families are both made and unmade, and asking about whether COVID is shaping or kind of implicated in the unmaking of families. And I think both migration and family formation and dissolution are kind of linked. So perhaps you could comment on those together or one at a time.
Okay. The issue about migration and family formation is, my immediate answer to that is of course migration shapes how families are constituted. And in different provinces in the country, there's different dynamics of migration. So I also work in a place called Asian Court, which is in Mpumalanga, which is a different province. And there you see migration, instead of men for jobs, you see migration of women moving into Johannesburg. And so you have families where you have, I suppose, a great grandmother, and the women have moved and she's looking after her great grandchildren. So that's kind of a different kind of family structure. Whereas with Nyanga East, which is an urban township, there isn't much migration because most people work in Cape Town, which is only 30 kilometers away. The unmaking of families question, just can you repeat that? So is it about how families are unmade?
It was about how the unmaking of families has changed with COVID, or whether it might change with COVID. Maybe it's still unfolding.
I mean, that's a very interesting question, in that what COVID has done is, despite the number of deaths, what COVID has done is actually bring families together in order to provide care. And so while during level 1 lockdown, people were asked not to travel, to be with family, especially if you lived outside the household, my sense is that COVID has actually brought families together in sharing the responsibilities of caring. And so the unmaking of families, I would rather say, I mean, my little experience of people in the township that I was talking about here in Johannesburg is that, families have created stronger ties, or people who live together in the household and care for each other have created stronger ties.
So there is a question that perhaps gets at some of the kind of experience of doing research at this moment, which is a question about how to do, it's someone who's doing a degree in social work and is thinking about doing research in Tanzania, but doing it virtually. So I presume doing it, I don't know, maybe between Tanzania and the US, or being in Tanzania, but having conversations over the phone or over Zoom. Is this something that you have drawn on, or that you see your research collaborators, the people who are participating in Connected Lives, for instance, like thinking about not just Zoom in the time of the pandemic, but how to use cell phones and text messages and WhatsApp as, as part of their research materials, as creating different kinds of spaces or possibilities for fieldwork?
Yes, I mean, at the beginning of lockdown, a lot of my colleagues who were teaching, because I am now based at a research institute, so I do not teach, but I will be going back to my department. They were having to rethink how their students would be doing research. And and most of it was around research with digital kind of ethnographies and research with cell phones and over Zoom and so forth. But I haven't heard of people thinking creatively around how to do that research. It's always, but also in South Africa, we have the issue of access, and not everyone has cell phones, although a lot of people do. But also not everyone knows how to use cell phones. They don't have the kind of cell phone literacy, especially if you work with much older people. So those are questions that have come up, and if you do this kind of research, you will only be working with a particular cohort of people. But recently in the Breath conference, the virtual symposium we just had, there was a very interesting paper by a young woman who's actually doing a master's degree. And what she did, which I still have no idea how the university could have given ethical clearance for it, was she rode around in ambulances with the emergency services during the time of COVID. And her paper, if anyone's interested, is titled, "There is no social distancing in an ambulance," and it's up on our website. So that could be possibly something that the person who asked the question might want to look at.
That's a great suggestion. And the link to the website is in the announcement for this event. It's in Nolwazi's bio, you can find the link to the conference. So I can also put it in the chat. So maybe we have time for one or two last questions. So I'll summarize two and you can pick up whichever one you would like. So there's a question about gender-based violence and thinking about the role of intimate partner violence in the formation and unformation of family relationships or of social relationships. And there's a question about the idea of teenage pregnancy as a norm that is nevertheless figured as a crisis. And the person who wrote the question is saying this resonates with what she sees in a subset of public debates about birth control in the US. And so can you expand on how you understand the production or dynamics of this state, sort of permanent state of exception that might be young pregnancy, and how that enables or constrains possibilities for care? So I guess two versions of crisis, one in terms of violence and one in terms of contraception and pregnancy.
About the gender-based violence question, what I want to say is that there are particular sets of stories that are told about young women's relationships, and when I arrived in South Africa, one of them was about intimate partner violence and the fact that sometimes young women were in relationships because they were coerced into them, and that also linked to transactional sex and to kind of intergenerational sexual relationships. And then there was also another kind of narrative around HIV, and that these young people were basically HIV positive, and as soon as you became a pregnant teenagers, the chances of becoming HIV positive were very high. And I must say that with the people that I worked with, I hardly encountered stories of gender-based violence or of young people being HIV positive. And I do not say that that doesn't exist. I mean, I'm not claiming that at all. But I'm just kind of cautioning the way we always want to lock people into this particular idea that if you're young, Black, and pregnant, you're possibly a victim of gender-based violence and you are HIV positive. And the second question about, you have to remind me.
The second question was about someone observing that your description of the kind of crisis of young pregnant women is a narrative that is actually quite similar to narratives in the US around access to birth control and contraception, and that there's a kind of constant moral crisis around that. And so asking what do those narratives of crisis do in terms of opening up possibilities for care or for closing or shutting off possibilities for care?
I mean, the crisis of teenage pregnancy, my immediate answer to that, and the way that it is framed in families, is more a crisis in terms of families and education. So when I talk about the fact that it is a norm, but yet it's looked at as crisis, it's what happens when a young woman becomes pregnant. And that's firstly that the family, that there's a lot of shame that goes with it. The family often, mothers don't talk to their daughters for a while. And she is in a way punished. But the thing is, once the baby is born, everything changes, and that child is a welcome member of the family. But part of that is also a performance, because in the larger sense, mothers have to perform a way of showing the community that this is not something that they approve of. But then, and what's really striking is that hardly any young women are ever kicked out of the house, which is what people imagine is going to happen. But no, the baby is welcomed, and then the young woman does a performance of showing kind of shame and regret, and then everything is smoothed over and life continues, and care happens and families survive. And I mean, this is something, teenage pregnancy, as we all know, is not a new thing, and it's highly likely that the mother herself became pregnant as a teenager. So yeah,
that's very helpful. Well, we are now over our allotted time. I wish we had more time to talk, but I want to thank Nolwazi for spending your Friday evening with us. We so appreciate it, and have so enjoyed this opportunity to talk about your work and think together. And I want to thank the audience for coming and bringing such good questions and being present with us. So in closing, I will, in addition to saying thanks, I'll urge everyone to check the website for the spring colloquium series listings. I'll wish everyone a nice winter break and hope to see you all in the spring. Thanks so much for being with us.